everybody here knows us, so welcome to Stories from the Porch. Tonight we have Tim Baxter, director of the cemetery? Director of the Oakwood Cemetery in Niagara Falls, New York, and he's going to be talking about 167 years at the cemetery. So thank you all for coming. Oh dear. You're going to have time.
Yeah, I guess so.
And so welcome, and I'm going to turn to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This is absolutely great. I love the atmosphere. I hope you don't mind if I don't stand too much. I like my seat.
We don't mind.
Yeah, that's good. So I'll skip my interpretive dance called Oakwood.
No, please don't.
Yeah. Yeah. So Oakwood Cemetery is over on the American side, and we were started in 1852. It was on land donated by Lavinia Porter, who is a daughter of Augustus Porter. Augustus and Peter Porter were the two original white businessmen, I should say, because I've been saying the original business people in Niagara Falls, but I'm sure that the Haudenosaunee or Senecas, they must have had business people, you know, I mean, how do you, so anyway, they were the first, white. Yeah, so they were the first ones that, you know, to set up the town of, the village of Manchester. Augustus Porter, when he came to town, he felt that when he looked at the falls, he saw industry in his head. And Manchester, England, was an industrial town. So he named it the village of Manchester. And it wasn't very big, considering what it is now, but it was in the, you know, just over where the Rainbow Bridge is, basically. And he and his brother Peter, they were the two guys that got things going, setting up streets and stuff like that. So the Porters are buried there in Oakwood, and Augustus Porter's daughter deeded the land as long as it became a cemetery. There was a cemetery by where, if you're familiar with the American side, where the Howard Johnson's is, right where you get on to the Scenic Parkway right now. That was a cemetery. It was called the Town Burying Ground. But in the early 1800s, 1830s, 1840s, there was a movement called the Rural Cemetery Movement. And they moved because these cemeteries were in next to churches or in the center of town, and they felt for sanitary reasons and for just space reasons, like, you know, I mean, they could use that land to develop for other things. In fact, the reason they moved the cemetery was two different railroad companies came through and bought half of that cemetery each. And the stipulation was, as long as you moved the people over and took care of that, that would be fine. So two different railroad companies moved everybody that was downtown into our cemetery, which was on the outskirts of town. Now it's all in town. It's all right downtown there. The rural cemetery movement usually had rolling hills, and you know, that's when cemeteries became kind of scenic, manicured, and flowers and trees, and people used to get in their carriage and ride out to the cemetery and have their picnics, and because what the cemeteries were back then were the early parks. There were no official parks back in the day. So we were on the outskirts of town, which is kind of odd. I mean, you could walk to where it is now.
Does everybody know where it is now?
No, where is exactly where
It's
right across from Tops.
yeah, right by Tops.
Everybody knows where
On
Tops.
Pine near
Over
Pine
the river.
Pine Avenue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Portage Road and Cedar Avenue. There's a light at our corner. But if you've gone to Tops, you've seen our cemetery. And it's odd because I grew up in Niagara Falls, New York, and I've been by that place a billion times, and it might have been a brick wall for all I knew. You know, I knew it was a cemetery. I never gave it two thoughts. And when I got this job 9 years ago, I started looking at the people that were there. I knew Annie was there. Annie is, she's one of the more famous people that's there. Annie Edson-Taylor.
Anyhow.
Yeah. Annie Edson-Taylor was the first person to go over the falls in a barrel. First person, not just man or woman or whatever. She was the first person to go over, and she was 63 when she did it. She was
She survived.
Yep.
Yeah.
She was the
First
first
one
person
to
to go
survive.
over and survive. So, I knew she was there, and I knew there's probably a couple other people there. But the more I started looking at all these different people that are there, I don't know why anybody didn't, put a website together, or I just couldn't believe it that I was the one that's getting to tell everybody about all the people here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the people that we do have. We mentioned Annie. I could pass these around. Maybe I am going to stand up because.
I'll be your young assistant.
Oh, this is my
Young
beautiful
assistant.
Good
assistant.
job, Dad.
Annie was 63 when she went over.
What?
She
Still hope for me.
a lot of people thought she was a crackpot, and I guess yay for crackpots. You go over the falls in a barrel. I guess he kind of.
Yeah, that's three.
But in 1901,
Three strikes.
what Annie was trying to do was make enough money to survive.
Yeah, making
And
money.
she
That's Annie
she
Hall.
was running out of money. She had her father wasn't well off, but he had enough money to
That's her
provide
barrel,
for
so
her.
over the falls.
Her husband had died, so her
So
biggest
she
fear was
was
going
gonna
to the
die
poorhouse,
anyway.
and she did not want that to happen. So she put together this. She devised this plan. 1901. She read in. She was in Bay City, Michigan. She read in the paper that President McKinley was coming to the Pan American Exposition, and she thought, "Wow, here's a good chance," because I'll bet you there's going to be a big crowd. So she talked a barrel maker into making a barrel. They were very reluctant. They didn't want to do it. It's suicide. I'm not going to help you. But she threw a couple of bucks in front of one of them, and he all of a sudden he thought, "Oh, I could probably put something together." But she wasn't. She was pretty smart about it. I mean, she made it as safe as she possibly could. She would get in the barrel during the day and look through see if there were any cracks, and if there were, she would put oil-soaked rags in there. She had harnesses and a mattress inside. She put an anvil on the bottom to keep herself upright, with the weight of the anvil. So she wasn't dumb about what she was doing. Her intent was not suicide. She wanted to make money, and that's all she wanted. She wasn't as interested in the fame, although she's getting that now. It's interesting. I'll talk about that in a second. But on the day that she went over, she was going to go over a couple of days before, and the weather wasn't great, so they pulled back. The guys that were going to row her out felt that it wasn't safe for them. They didn't feel that they could come back, so they called that off, and she wasn't happy. But whatever. If you see the picture, there's a cat in the picture. There's all kinds of stories about her going over with the cat. And I mean, if you know a cat, I wouldn't go over with a cat in the barrel. Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't come out, that, but they could kill you before the... Anyway, she did not go over with a cat, but she had a cat, and it was called Niagara, with like Niagara, only without the N. Okay. In the movie on the American side, it's because we get people asking all the time about it. The cat goes in black and comes out white. And they all in, and the cat went in black. No cat went in anywhere. But she went over before they closed the lid.
Assistant.
Yeah, my beautiful assistant. Before they went over, she pressurized her barrel with a bicycle pump. So she was pushing against the water so it wouldn't come in. Anyway, she went over. She got knocked around pretty good, but she was just as amazed as anyone that she made it. And when they unscrewed the lid, Carlisle Graham, who was a barrel maker on the American side, not the person that made her barrel, he said, "My God, the woman's alive." He was amazed.
My God, she.
And here they are getting her out of the barrel.
No.
The guy with his
Somebody.
the guy with his hand on her back, that's Carlisle Graham, and we'll talk about him in a couple of minutes. But
That's the guy you know.
yeah, the guy with the handlebar
That's this
mustache.
guy.
No thanks.
Yeah. So
It's
she
only
had
last week, right?
yeah. She had a conk on the head, and it was bleeding, and she got knocked pretty silly, but she survived. And then, unfortunately, she had promoted herself as being 42 years old, and in fit health. She swam in lakes and mountains and stuff like that. So when she went on tour, everybody was looking, when she got off the train, they'd be looking for Annie, and they're looking around this little old lady that got off but it was her. So she didn't sell very many tickets. She was kind of a prickly kind of person, and so she didn't quite, go over. And what happened was her manager got tired of dealing with her and the personality, and so he stole her barrel and he hired a pretty Annie, and they went on tour.
Wow.
So she got screwed over. She then spent what money she did have trying to get her barrel back, and she got it back, but apparently somehow they lost it again. I don't know what happened to it, but she was this was one of the things she did. She signed cards downtown. She's bored. She wasn't putting on a show for the camera, that's for sure. She's sitting there in this picture like and she would sign for a couple of 10 cents or whatever. She had a little booklet too that she wrote explaining everything. But she ended up 20 years after the...
Is that Clifton Hill?
I don't think so. I think that's on the American side.
What?
So she ended up in the poorhouse, exactly where she didn't want to be. In 1921, she passed away.
She went over to Horseshoe Falls.
Correct. Right.
Canadian side.
Yep.
But did she live in Niagara Falls, New York after? Or?
Yeah. She tried to do that tour thing.
Yeah.
But then she came back and she signed autographs downtown and sold her postcards.
I love her.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she was a school teacher, but she's not like a put your apple on the desk kind of school teacher. She was more, she would teach etiquette or teach, and then she'd get thrown out because she didn't pay the rent, so the next town she'd be a piano teacher. or a dance teacher. Well, you know, she taught whatever she, you know, she just made money. So poor Annie. But right now there's a resurgence. I mean, we've had a Hollywood producer contact us. They want to put together a movie. And the lady was talking to Annette Bening, and you know, I mean, I thought at first it was kind of like, oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
But then she mentioned a couple people she talked to, and I was like,
Get on it. Get on it.
yeah, really. So, and there's a off-Broadway play, Queen of the Mist. You can get the CD online if you want. And it's right now. It's not playing in New York, but it's playing in Chicago and London.
Huh.
So, and the lady that's playing her in London has written me a couple of times, and she's coming in November. So I can't wait to meet her in
that's
person.
exciting.
We gotta have another talk.
Yeah, there we go. So that's Annie.
Well, I'll show them.
So Carlisle Graham was the guy with his hand on her back. Carlisle Graham was a barrel maker, and Carlisle in the early days went through the Whirlpool Rapids.
That's hard.
Yeah, he went through, and he survived. In fact, he went through 5 times over the years.
What an idiot.
What kind of device did he go in? Was he in a barrel?
He was in a barrel. He was a Cooper, and I mean that was, you know, what he did. So
Yeah.
Check it out.
he, you know, I mean, he made a barrel for himself. The first time he went through, he was, it was in the dark. You know, I mean, he had the lid closed, obviously, and so he got really seasick. You know, I mean, he had no point of reference. And so he thought, you know what? Next time I'm going to go through, I'm going to put my head out. And he made a hole. And he stuck his head out. But then he got hit by a wave, and he was deaf for the rest of his life in that ear.
Wow.
So, so that idea didn't work out too well. But Carlisle was kind of a rascal of his own self. He was like the king of the daredevils, though, back in that day. He kept saying, I'm going to go over the falls with my barrel. And he didn't, he never did. And Andy came along and did.
Wow.
So he wasn't choked up with me. But he was the one that unscrewed her lid and said, oh, my God, she's alive.
Oh my God, that's made it.
He hooked up with a showgirl called Maud Willard. Here's Carlisle. Is that around there? He is.
Oh, I've seen that picture.
Yeah, it's kind of a famous one.
There's some chairs. Wherever you like.
So, I forgot to say hello to YouTube.
Oh, you told.
So Carlisle was kind of a rascal. He liked the bars, I think, and a little rough living. And one day in 1889, he went into one of his taverns that he hung out in. He was all wet. Guys, I just went over the falls. They were like, "You're kidding, dude, that's awesome." And then they were talking, and they were like, "Well, wait a minute. What time did you say you went over?" And, you know, I mean, it turns out he didn't go over the falls. He was at his friend's house or something at the time he said he was going. And it was all in the paper. It's like the paper didn't care. They just wrote it all out, and, you know, they didn't cover for him at all. It was...
What, 1906?
Holy cow. They let him have it.
Damn.
So, but I think it's funny that he was all wet. Like, what did he do? Pour water? And then he went to the bar.
Well, just water.
Yeah. So he, anyway,
Garden hose.
he didn't go over the falls, but Annie did. So he hooked up with Maud Willard,
This isn't real.
who was a showgirl.
Lola.
She wanted to make enough money to put a down payment on a house for her mom. The thing is, these people, you know, we might think of them as crackpots, but me running a cemetery, there's really a human side to it, you know. I mean, that's, Annie needed the money, Carlisle wanted fame, Maud wanted to buy a house for her mom.
You're buying into it.
And so what was supposed to happen is Maud was going to borrow Carlisle's barrel, go through the whirlpool, and when it got to the turn where it goes down to Lewiston or Queenston, Carlisle was going to jump in the water there and swim behind the barrel. Well, the barrel came down through the whirlpool rapids. It got to the whirlpool, and then it just kept going around.
On top.
And this was the day that President McKinley came to the Pan American Exposition, and he was on a trolley, the Great Gorge route, that went from downtown to Lewiston. So there's a possibility that he may have seen the barrel going around, although I don't know if he would know.
Yeah.
You know,
What's that garbage? Debris.
So he, anyway, she ended up going around for 5 or 6 hours. And when they finally got to her, she had suffocated. And she's in the cemetery. But she brought her little dog with her terrier. And the terrier, it's the story goes, stuck its nose out the hole because it needed to breathe too.
Barrel hole.
And plugged up her air, you know. And so if you're gonna go through the thing, don't bring your dog.
Very bad.
Poor Maud, though. I feel bad for her. I mean, she's, poor girl's trying to buy her mom a house. So that's Carlisle and Maud. They were hooked up kind of together. They were friends, and that's another reason. I mean, this was September 6th, 1901, which is just a month before Annie went over. And I'm wondering if Carlisle's thinking about, well, I just lost my friend, you know, and he's trying to talk Annie out of it. She's thinking it's because, you know, he doesn't want her to have any of the fame. But it could be, you know, like, hey, I just lost my friend. I don't know. That's how it could be. Another interesting thing, too, that my friend Christine Bacon points out is that the barrel was Carlisle's choice because he was a barrel maker. I mean, that was the simplest thing for him to do. Annie may have read that Carlisle was going through with these barrels and thought, wait a minute, I could go over the falls in a barrel, or saw articles that Carlisle was saying that I'm going to go over the falls in a barrel. So that's where she may have gotten the idea and where this whole barrel thing started from Carlisle. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, so in 1875, Captain Matthew Webb, who wasn't actually a captain, previous, they call him captain because he worked on one of the cruise lines, like the White, I don't know if it was the White Star, it was like a cruise line over in England. And somebody fell overboard. And he jumped in after them, which is a no-no. He didn't find the guy, but he swam and swam and swam looking for him. And when he came back, they named him Captain Matthew Webb because it was an honorary thing, and he kept it for the rest of his life. So Captain Matthew Webb in 1875 decided to be the first person to swim the English Channel. A guy had gone over previous, but he had a big flotation suit on. It was like that kid in Christmas Story where he's got the snowsuit. It was like that, and it was blown up. But that's kind of cheating. You know, he just floated across. Captain Matthew Webb left Calais, France. Or did he land? He landed in Calais, France. I think. Calais is in there one way.
Starter.
Took him 22 hours. The curtains are nasty. The jellyfish bite. They fed him beer and roast beef on the way, so you gotta think that's gotta be comfortable. But he needed a lot of carbs, you know what I mean, to stay, to keep going. But he made it. He was the first person. He became an instant celebrity. He was like, he went viral back in England. He was like, he got to hang out with Queen Victoria. They made matchbook covers with his pictures on them.
Wow.
And it's said that, I don't know if it's this one or there's another version, that Peter Sellers got the idea for Clouseau, you know, from seeing the picture on the matches. And people, that was so popular. I mean, he was so popular that they, over in England, they would say, "Do you have a web?" instead of "Do you have a light?" You know, I mean, that was the thing.
Because he swam for days.
He was quite a guy, but once again, how much can you make out of swimming? You know, he swam in exhibitions where he would swim in a tank for 3 or 4 days or whatever it was, a week, inside, so that was probably cold. And, you know, I mean, he was doing that kind of stuff, and he thought, well, if I go to the falls, what I'll do is I'll set it up with the hotels and the trains, and I'll take a cut of their action because people will come and see me because I'm Captain Matthew Webb. So when he got here,
What year?
this was 1883. So
Train used to come up here, this street.
he used, oh yeah, he used to go. 1875 was his channel trip, and then 1883 he came here. And when he got here, the hotels and the trains were like, "Yeah, we're not giving you any money." And, so he ended up going anyway. I don't know why. He may have not had anything. He may have felt like he had nothing to lose. The guy that rode him out, this is below the falls. He went through the Whirlpool Rapids. The guy that rode him out, tried to talk him out of it. He said, "You got to have money from the, you know,
Something.
going over the
Channel swim.
through the channel."
Money,
And, you know, I mean, let's just turn around. We'll go back, and you could go back to England to your family. He goes, "No, I promised them." And so anyway, he got out to the middle of the river and jumped, and the guy rode back. But they lost sight of him after 4 minutes. And the interesting thing is the autopsy showed that he did not drown, which would have been, you know, I mean, yeah, I mean, what happened is he got, they think he got dashed against a rock or something, and they said it was a crushing injury. So he was stuck there for a while. He turned up a couple of days later in Lewiston or Queenston.
Wow.
This is his grave back in the day, and it's still there. That's a nicer picture than it is now. It's a lot of people there. Yep. That little one next to him is Francis Abbott. Francis Abbott was the hermit of Niagara, and he lived on Goat Island. And he was an odd bird. I don't know, I think he might have been pushing a shopping cart around nowadays. He was a poor guy. He lived on Goat Island, and he would take his bath, his daily bath in the falls between the Three Sister Islands. And one day he turned up missing, so they found him in Lewiston. So they figured he probably went in and currents swept them away. Nobody really saw it. They just know that they found it. One of the interesting things that he used to do, we could play Where's Waldo, Where's Francis, in this picture. One of the interesting things he used to do, there was a tower right on the edge of the Horseshoe Falls, Terrapin Tower, and there was a walkway out to it. There was a ramp that extended out over the edge of the falls for any of those tourists that were, wanted an extra thrill. And I think you could count me out, but I mean, it hung out over the edge, and then you could go look down. He would hang off of that thing for 10 or 15 minutes, and the crowds would go crazy because, they thought he was great. So here he is. That's in that. I don't know if you can make him out, but he's hanging there by one hand. Do you see him? Yeah. That's the only picture known that he's actually doing his stunt.
Wow.
So.
I don't want to know this man.
He was an interesting character. Patrick writes about him every year, and he's in. Patrick goes into a lot of detail about him.
He was a strange character. When he first arrived at Goat Island, he was dressed in a long brown robe. And people think that perhaps his family over in France, is that where he was from?
I believe so.
Yeah, his family was well off, and he had traveled the world and been just about everywhere.
Wearing silk.
And last April Fool's, I did an April Fool's joke.
Yeah, I remember.
I wrote a big story about the hermit and them finding bones in the cave at Bender's Point on the Canadian side. And I tried to make it sound very professional. And I wrote that there was a big meeting. It was a press gag, but a big meeting amongst the historians. Blah, blah, blah. Long story short, it was the bones of the hermit. So actually, who was buried at Oakwood Cemetery?
That was.
And then people fell for it.
Yeah.
I got about 30 or 40 reply. Oh my God, this is too much. Blah, 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 blah.
Wow.
But once people caught on, I think some people got mad at me. They wouldn't talk to me for a while. But it really fooled everybody. It was great.
One of my April Fool's thing was I said Canada wants Goat Island back,
Oh yeah.
and they're gonna come and get it, and people got so upset.
No, you can have
Like it's
it.
a joke. It's April Fool.
You can have it. It's like Ellesmere Island. We don't want that either.
And then I wrote the Canadians were setting up a goal at Goat Island.
Yeah, right.
So here's Joel Robinson. He was a captain. He was a real captain. He was a riverman. He was like the hills before the hills. He would rescue people. He had a long iron pole, and he would wade out into the upper Niagara, almost right at the brink, and he'd plant his pole and take a couple steps, then plant his pole. There's a picture we have on the website of him doing that. But he was a riverman. He knew the currents and all that. So in 1860, they decided to sell the Maid of the Mist boat. But they needed to get it out of the gorge. And the best way that they knew how, because they couldn't lift it like they could now with a giant crane, was to ride it through the whirlpool.
Yeah, I'm in.
So Captain Robinson volunteered. He got a couple of crew guys.
Yeah, I'm in.
And
No
they took
steam required.
The one thing that they said was he found out real quick that he was in absolute no control of he was at the whim of the water, and it kind of shook him up a little bit when he realized there's nothing I could do other than stand here and watch.
Yes.
And when they got to the suspension bridge, one of the guy wires that were down in the gorge took one of the smokestacks off, and the one engineer that he was with got a conk on the head pretty good, but they all survived, all three of them. They went through, and they were able to sell the boat. And but it's said that Captain Robinson never got on another boat again. He lived another year or two. He died when he was 52.
Wow.
So
That's the one going through the whirlpool or the rapids.
this story is kind of interesting. It's hard to see, but those are people flying kites over the gorge. So there's a kid named Holman Walsh. He was 16 years old. And when they were putting the first bridge together, they were trying to figure out, how are we going to get the wire across? This is 1848, so they couldn't put it in a boat and go across. And they thought, well, can we do it with fireworks? You know, like put it on a firework and send it over, or a cannon? Can we do that? And none of those ideas seemed to work. But one of the bridge engineers, Theodore Hewlett, said, why don't we try flying a kite? And so what they did was they set up this contest. And the kid, Holman Walsh, was 16 years old. He came over here on the Canadian side because that's the way the winds blow over to the American side. And he flew his kite. It took a couple of tries, but he was the first one to land his kite on the American side. And then they tied a rope to the string, and then tied a wire to the rope, and they kept pulling it back and forth until they actually had, the wire that they needed, the cable that they needed to build the first bridge. So it's kind of an interesting story. He got $5 or $10, depending on which story you read.
That's an awesome story.
Yeah. There's a kid's book that the lady that wrote it, she's a school teacher, and she came to Oakwood for the book signing when she kicked it off, and she was like, we invited her, and she was like, are you kidding? I'm going to have a kid's book signing in the cemetery? But when she got there, it really was. It was awesome. We had kite demonstrations, and she signed it in the thing, and she loved it.
Alexis O'Neill.
Yes. Yeah, she loved it.
Is she local?
She's not. Well, she's from Albany area originally, but she's.
That's okay. We still like her.
Yeah. She's from the Albany area, but she lives out in California now.
Okay.
But she still stays in touch, and she likes things on her Facebook when she sees them and stuff. She set up a thing where, like a guide for teachers. Like there was she put a lot of thought into it, and it's quite popular in elementary schools.
I allowed a question.
Sure.
Why don't you get a van and have a tour and charge $25 a person for this?
Yeah. Well, I'm all for it.
You do tours at the cemetery.
We do tours on Sundays. The reason we do them on Sundays is because it's the day we're an active cemetery. So we don't. I don't like to have
Can't let this go.
a tour.
You gotta let it out.
Right. But I don't like the tours to interfere with a funeral. So we usually do it on Sundays because that's the least likely day that they would run into each other. Here's Maud Willard in her stone. And one of the last people we'll talk. Well,
There's another 28, but
yeah. So Parkhurst Whitney, he was brigadier general, I believe, of not the army, but it was the militia. It was the state militia that he raised. So the state militia, everybody on the border, they all kind of knew everybody on both sides because everybody went back and forth. There was no big deal back then. And this is the 1812, the beginning of the War of 1812. So Parkhurst Whitney was put in charge of this militia, and he was part of the guys that went over when they burned Queenston, and then the British came back and they burned Lewiston. But then they kept going. They burned Buffalo, and then they burned Washington and the White House, and you know, they didn't
But
stop.
the war was over though.
Yeah,
The war was over when they did that.
right.
They didn't have internet.
Yeah, there you go.
They
Nobody
didn't know
they
yet.
didn't get the
That
message.
was over.
So Parkhurst Whitney, the long and short of it is, the guys that were in the regular army, they got stuck over in Canada as prisoners of war if they got captured. But the militia, everybody was friends, you know, so they let everybody go after a couple of like
Give me Eddie, you can have fun.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. But Parkhurst Whitney, he started the Cataract House, and I don't know if you guys know that, but that was it was a huge hotel downtown, right by the falls, and it was wooden, and they kept adding on to it. Abraham Lincoln came and stayed there. It was the place back in the day. It also became a place for a stop for the Underground Railroad. A lot of the wait staff were African Americans, former slaves, or just freed men that were that worked there, and they would have relatives over here in Canada. So if a Southern guy shows up with his slave, they were like, "Hey, you want to go to Canada?" And you know, yeah, sure, you know. So there's articles in the paper. If you're a Southern gentleman, you ought not to go to Cataract House with proprietor Whitney, you know, because he's going to take your slave. That was against the law. Now, there's nothing that says that he actively knew, you know, anything about it. But as a proprietor of a big hotel, there's no way
How
he
could you
couldn't
not?
have. Yeah, how could you not know? So he, I mean,
What's going on?
he just turned a blind. Yeah, yeah. What? You guys are taking people to Canada?
Another shot for everybody.
So he was like an early person for the Underground Railroad, and I might want to put a plug in here for the. Has anybody been to the Underground Railroad Museum that just opened up over there?
Haven't been yet.
It's awesome. It's small, but it's so packed with information. If you look at, people go in there and they say, "Give me my money back. This is only a," you know, but they're not
Road,
reading
we got
anything.
A really big place here on Stone Church
Oh,
Road
okay,
in Portage. It's Underground Railroad.
yeah. But they
And
they put a lot of thought into the museum, and it's really well done. And it just got an award from the American Museum Association or something like that. It's in the brand new train station right over.
Oh, the
like
Amtrak station.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it's I think it's $10 or whatever, but it's well worth it. It's they have a little gift shop.
Yeah, American dollars.
Yeah. This is
$12.50.
a painting that's on the wall of the Red Coach Inn in Niagara Falls, New York. That's Parkhurst Whitney welcoming Marquise de Lafayette with his stagecoach and everything. So Parkhurst Whitney's daughters, that's the Cataract Hotel, that other. That one is in the Red Coach Inn. That's. It's well, it is. It's more of a restaurant, yeah. But yeah, it's right down there, right by the
Mud
falls.
floors.
Yeah, it has a nice patio.
Mm-hmm.
That in 1945, it burned down,
Raised.
and they couldn't save it. It was all wood, and obviously at that point it was over 100 years old.
Get rid of it.
It was, but they did just do archaeology on that spot.
They got metallurgy.
I don't know what they got, but it would be interesting to see what they,
Yeah.
what they could find.
Shoes, bottles.
One of the last guys we'll talk about, he's not buried there, but this is Nathaniel Dett. He was a famous African American composer, and if you look him up, the music's amazing. There's a Nathaniel Dett chorale in Toronto that, if you listen to the music, it's unbelievable.
Manual debt.
They were one of the families that there was a bit of a scrape over on the American side, and their mom brought them over here because she felt it would be safer. I think a neighbor mistakenly, he shot it. He thought the kids were messing with him.
Do you know the story?
I think it was the other way around, Tim.
Oh, that they
His
went over.
brother was shot at up in Maine and Barrie
Okay.
on Halloween.
I knew somebody was shot.
I wasn't
And
there.
he died like the next day. So his mother packed up the kids
I moved to.
and moved to the American side.
Oh, I'm
But
thinking it was.
Nathaniel still came across the bridge to go
Right.
to school. I think that's how it worked.
Excellent.
Yeah, but Rick
He's-
his brother Arthur was.
He's buried at Fairview.
Nathaniel,
Nathaniel is. His dad is buried at Oakwood.
Oh, yeah,
Robert.
That's the British Methodist Episcopal Church on Pier Street,
1921,
named after
before World
Nathaniel
War
Dett.
Yeah.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I think it just closed because they
Mini
took out
church.
all they
Well,
just had
he
like some
works at the
signs and
history of
plaques there,
Niagara, the
but apparently
Museum
they're
of
not there
Niagara
anymore.
Falls
So
here.
I don't know what's happening with it.
Wow. There's so much history here. It's amazing.
See?
On both sides.
It's a shared history.
It is a
Yes,
shared
it is.
history, and
A lot
I
of people
love the
have no
fact that
idea.
we're all together. You know,
How's this subdivision was designed by an American architect.
Oh,
Because
for
it's
the-
all circles,
is that right?
and on the Canadian side, it's all north, south,
Oh, there you
east,
go.
west. But this one, because it's
The
like
one development.
1800s.
It's the Chautauqua model. Yeah.
Excellent. So where are we?
Oh, let's check the time, Tim. It's 7:30, so
Wow. I didn't think I was going to have enough to say.
yeah. Do people have any questions for Tim?
How much to hire you as a tour guide?
Well, our tours on Sundays are $10. So
You should go check it out.
yeah,
Can I tell a little story about my visit to Oakwood?
certainly.
When I first started a few years ago researching Annie Taylor, I went over to historic Oakwood Cemetery because I knew she was buried there. Knocked on the door the first time I met Tim. So I was inquiring about Annie Taylor, and he gave me the 25-cent tour. We jumped in a little golf cart, went around the cemetery, showed me a few things. Then we went way to the back to the mausoleum. You remember that? And we're standing outside talking in front of the mausoleum. A car pulls up with Texas plates. The woman gets out of the car, and it's Annie Taylor's great-granddaughter or great-grandniece who
Wow.
was in town to
Just
portray
checking
Annie
it out.
Taylor.
That's
All on the same day.
That's
I left
amazing.
the cemetery that day feeling very spooked out.
Yeah, she's a great. She sends a contribution every year.
That's amazing.
So it's really nice. I mean, I guess she's done kind of well for herself, and she looks out for Annie. A little while ago, Ellen DeGeneres did a little skit on her show, and she had pigtails, and she played her like real, you know. And I was going to put that on. Because I'm figuring, hey, it's Ellen. I don't. But I called and I asked Elsie, and I said, what do you think of that? And she goes, if that were your aunt, what would you think of it? And I was like, oh, okay, you're right. So
Yeah.
I took it down. And ever since then, I've kind of taken the same, if this were my aunt, what would I do?
Defend it.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And that's why I say, people come in and they, oh, what a crackpot. Well, it's 1901. Women can't vote. what she, I mean, it's not like they're going to hire her off the street for, you know, I mean, that was her shot at making some decent money, and she was willing to risk it all for, you know, I mean, that's how dire things were back then. And
She was very intelligent about it.
oh,
She just
Yeah.
didn't.
no,
I mean,
she
She
exactly.
knew what she was doing, and she thought ahead.
Yeah,
so she was
right.
probably ahead of her time.
Oh my gosh! And she didn't, you know, I admire her tenacity because she didn't take no. Like a couple of those coopers or barrel makers, they were like, no, you're going to kill yourself. And she obviously didn't, you know, let that get her down. She wanted to
Put
do
some
it.
weights
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting thing about that. There was a guy that went over in the barrel, and he tried. It was a wooden barrel. He tried to put an anvil on the bottom to keep him upright.
Stevens.
And he who was it?
Stevens, his name was.
Stevens. Well, they found his arm in the harness because when he hit the bottom, the anvil pulled him, and they knew it was him because there was a tattoo on.
They never found his body. They
They found his arm.
buried his arm in. They have a section of our cemetery called Floatage Corners, where they find bodies. That's where they put them.
Because where Annie is buried, it's actually called Stranger's Rest, and they call it that because back in the 1800s, it wasn't like now where you have embalming and you would ship somebody back or whatever. If you passed away while you're on vacation, they would bury you right, you know, where it was. So you know, I don't know how Annie ended up in Stranger's Rest, but it was donated by the cemetery, and so was Carlisle's. They're right next to each other for all eternity. And a couple doors down is Matthew Webb, and then right next to him is Francis Abbott. So, and I'll let you in on a little secret, if we keep it between us. We have Kirk Jones, who was a daredevil that, well, he went over in 2003, he went over and without anything. And so there's some thought that there might have been a suicide attempt, you know, but he lived through it, so he said he was doing a daredevil stunt. Then he tried it again in 2017, and this one he didn't make out. But he had a little thing, a little device on his wrist that a drone was supposed to follow. So he figured he would do the stunt in this big plastic bubble thing with his boa constrictor, and it didn't quite work out. I think he tried to go over the American Falls. I'm not sure.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The state police still have the ball, and I called just to ask about it. You know, I didn't want it. I just wanted to know, do you guys have it, or, you know, where is it? And the guy goes, well, you can't have it. I said, I don't want it. I just wonder where it was, you know. So, but apparently they do have it. It's in their storage thing. So, but anyway, nobody claimed Kirk. His family didn't want him. The family that was left. So I called the county treasurer who handles calls like that, and they put me in touch with the funeral director they assigned, and I talked to him, and he donated the cremains to Oakwood, because we're going to donate a grave for him, just like we did for Annie and Carlisle and Matthew, and I'm sure Francis. So we're going to get another daredevil in the near future. So.
Cool.
Wow.
Will he rest alongside the others?
Yeah, I'm finding a spot near Annie.
Oh, that's
Great.
fantastic.
Yeah. Poor guy. I feel
Yeah.
he's another one I feel bad for. Obviously, there were problems.
Yeah.
And if you read the articles, there were issues, and
Yeah, it is.
so. But again, he was a person, just like, you know. So that's it.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Tim. That was really interesting. I mean, most of the people I have heard of before and did know a little bit about, but you really shed a lot of light on some of the interesting residents of the Oakwood Cemetery. Thank you all for coming. Please help yourself to snacks, coffee, tea, water. And next week we have Leila Paw. She is going to be talking about her adventure this past May on Route 66. Her and her dad took a bit of a lifetime trip and drove from Chicago to California along Route 66 and did some very interesting things along the way and on the way back. So thank you again, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.